What we're going to talk about today is the concept of the Tabernacle system of Adam. Now, the Tabernacle system of Adam is an extremely complicated and detailed, layered, and cobbled together idea. This cobbled together idea is a idea and a concept that partially comes from the Bible, the Tabernacle system. It partially comes from archaeology and looking at the actual physical, tangible evidence that's been left behind. Now, one of the problems about conquest cultures, specifically the Hyksos, who come directly from ECU, the brother of Jacob, the father of the Jews, is that he was not chosen to be head of the Tabernacle system of Adam, otherwise known as the title of Pharaoh. He was not chosen to be that. And he had a chip on his shoulder from that moment to his last breath, and he taught his people, his children and wives and slaves and people who he protected and he had within his family group, his tribe, collection of tribes, what have you. He had them all indoctrinated into the same concept of find the Jews, find everything they do, everything they're working on, their knowledge, their libraries, their experiences, their versions of Genesis, so on, and destroy it. The Hyksos took this on full on and heavy, although the Hyksos is really not their name. It has been lost to history what the Hyksos' actual name was. It's been lost to history what ECU's actual name was. Those are all Greek translations millennia later. ECU and Jacob were about 2500 BC. The Hyksos are 2100 BC, although Mecca was not conquered from 26 to several centuries, if not millennia later. So, since it wasn't conquered when ECU conquered it, which there's archaeological evidence for to show what happened. By the way, that conquest is also where the Hajj started. The Hyksos came into Egypt and immediately started to destroy the pyramids. Immediately started to destroy the Jews. And continued from 21 to 1350. And continued from 2100 BC up to 1530, when they were destroyed by a natural event. The Thera volcano, which was a mega volcano, it was and is, destroyed the bulk of the culture and bulk of the army that was living on the island of Santorini at the time. Not a small amount of them were living on Crete and other Aegean islands, especially the mainland. The bulk of the culture was there, leaving only a token force in Egypt, because why would you want to be in Egypt when you could be in Greece? It's several hundred miles farther north, and a whole lot cooler in the summer. When the Thera volcano exploded at around 1530, when that occurred, it obliterated everybody and everything within 100 miles, including pushing a mega ship that would be later reorganized, reworked with, and redesigned, rebuilt as a double pair of ships in Lake Nemi by the Emperor Caligula, which is where some of the strongest evidence regarding what the actual configuration of the Tabernacle system of Adam ships looked like. The ship's part comes in with Noah. It also has a strong amount to do with the pyramids and Pharaoh Narmer, or also known as the Scorpion King at 3200 BC. This is where the evidence can be looked at, can be examined and found. Noah's Ark configuration is the animals 2 by 2. This is Indo-European language because Sumerian wouldn't be invented for 500 years. Neither would hieroglyphics. So the animals 2 by 2 is a completely different concept and application of information than has been translated into Sumerian, and then Akkadian, and then hieroglyphics, and then unknown language, and then into very, 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 very Proto-Greek. There's also like 20 versions of Greek, from Linear C1 to Linear C20. Linear C about 7 to 10 is where Proto-Greek starts showing up. But that's not the end of where Proto-Greek started or had other languages influence its development. You don't actually get to Proto-Greek until closer to Linear C15. A lot of battles, a lot of fighting, a lot of wars, a lot of cultures fighting for dominance. The Athenians fighting the Spartans, the Thracians. You name the cultures. Every city-state fought against each other and fought against themselves for dominance, and there's lots of invasions and lots of uncool stuff going on. And all that fighting for dominance is where the Tabernacle system of Adam system information was lost. Because partially it was intended to be lost because a lot of the Dorians and the Spartans were descendants of the Hyksos, who were descendants from ECU, and ECU hated his brother, so he wanted to have every aspect of his brother's information destroyed. Now, continuing on. One of the primary problems with the Tabernacle system of Adam is that two of the systems are built into the pyramids. The secondary one is not as important for this specific conversation as the first. The first is go to the Pep in the first pyramid. Now draw a line from it to the Nativity, the Cave of the Nativity. The Church of the Nativity was built over a cave, and that cave had been there for an unknown amount of time. Now draw a line from the Cave of the Nativity, the Church of the Nativity, several miles north to the Temple Mound. It has a mosque sitting there now, but it was a Jewish temple for 1,000 years, give or take. Now, there's a cave, natural spring cave, under where King Solomon's temple used to be. Now, this supposedly is the location where Jesus did his whip situation. He took his whip and money changers and started whipping the money changers for demanding money from the poor to buy tokens, and each more expensive token would buy you a farther and farther reach into the temple. If you couldn't afford anything at all, then you were forced to worship outside. If you had a little bit of money, you can come inside, and if you were extremely rich, you can buy a token that allowed you into either the tent surrounding the Sanctum Sanctorum, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, although it had been removed 800 years before by the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Or you can go into the tent where the Ark of the Covenant used to be 800 years before. Now, this was entirely unacceptable in all ways, shapes, and forms to Jesus, and he took his whip and overturned the tables and whipped the money changers and the priests present because they were profiting off of access to the divine. They couldn't go into the temple because if you were poor, you were not allowed into the temple. This is a problem. Well, that's the location that supposedly took place. The evidence points to a different location entirely on a different continent, but that's a different video. Now draw a line from the middle of that cave under the Temple Mound, under where King Solomon's temple used to be, also Zerubbabel's temple. We don't know what King Solomon's temple used to look like. We do have an idea of what Zerubbabel's temple used to look like, even though they were made out of the same parts. When the temple was taken down, it was destroyed by an invasion about 50 years, 100 years, or give or take, after the Ark of the Covenant was removed. Where the Ark of the Covenant was removed to is a very interesting story, which involves Lake Tana. But it also involves the beginning of the slave trade, which is a very, very interesting thing, but a story for a different time. The Lake Tana, there's an island in the middle of the lake that supposedly held where the Ark of the Covenant held the Ark of the Covenant for several centuries, decades, what have you. And there's a huge library there that is completely and thoroughly restricted by the librarians that are there, although it has some really interesting archaeological stuff in it. Interesting books, interesting stuff, interesting ceremonial accoutrements, which have to do with electricity because they are, in effect, Faraday cages or Tesla cages that prevented the wearer from being electrocuted, which goes back to 2x2 Noah. 2 towers on the bow, 2 towers on the stern, times 2 towers on the bow and 2 towers on the stern. That is the configuration of the Lake Nemi ships that Caligula had built, based off of assuming, with a massive amount of circumstantial evidence, that he was a Jew, the Julii family were Jews, and that he directly helped the creation of Christianity. He was at the crucifixion. So were about a dozen or 2 dozen, 3 dozen Roman senators were at the crucifixion because they were, can you imagine, fat, horrible, disgusting, greedy as all get out Roman senators all accepting the fact that they were not going to see Jesus, their main number one enemy, the biggest enemy, the biggest threat to the entire Roman Empire, to be executed 2,000 miles away? I don't think so. They would want to feel his last breath. They would want to see his chest cavity stop moving. They would want to see that blade plunge in and know that he was no longer a threat. Hence the INR, Rex, King, I. That INRI, that king, means that Jesus was the definition of a threat, because the overwhelming majority of the population of Rome were Jewish slaves. What does this matter? A huge amount for events that took place 50 years later during Vespasian's time. Also, massive amount of information regarding what happened during Julia's time, and also Caligula. Caligula did 2 amazing things that had direct bearing and direct influence with the Tabernacle system of Adam. Now you go from King Solomon's temple, the cave, the center of the cave, and you draw a line from the center of the cave down to the Bent Pyramid, which is south of the Pepin the First Pyramid. The Pepin the First Pyramid was built at 2100 BC, and the Bent Pyramid was one of the first at 2600 BC. The caves were older, but the buildings on top of them were built millennia later. For King Solomon's, it would be 1000 BC, which would be 1100 years after the Pepin I. And for the Nativity, that would be built by Empress Helena, the mother of Constantine. And that whole situation is massive fiction all by itself. Is so well hidden by the Romans that it's close to impossible to find the truth unless you apply logic and reason and, of course, statistics. Pepin I to the Nativity to King Solomon's Temple, King Solomon's Temple to the Met Pyramid, back to Pepin I Pyramid. This makes an infinity loop. It is also Tabernacle System of Adam, because based off of a variety of information and research from the Freemasonic organization, each Freemasonic temple lodge is a 3-story building, or 3-story kabah, for lack of a better concept. But there wasn't one kabah, there were 4. Because previous in Mecca, there's not one kabah. The other 3 were destroyed to focus in on the furthering of the application of the idea that there was just one tree of creation, not 4. Sumerian sentence structure says there was 4. Those commas are individual trees, not one tree with different aspects. Learn Sumerian, you'll learn a lot. The 2 by 2 is the configuration of the buildings inside King Solomon's Temple. That had to be changed and altered a considerable amount when Zerubbabel rebuilt it, because he had to let people know in a very defined and intense way that that building was not El Bethel. That was not where Judaism began. That's where Hebrewism began. But Hebrewism and Judaism are 2 entirely separate things altogether. They're 2 entirely different kingdoms, let alone phylum and species and such. They're as high up the rankings as possible. They're different. It's kind of like comparing a mammal with a snail. There's not a lot they have to do in common with each other. There's only one small ceremony that the Jews used that was incorporated into Hebrew, and that's the male circumcision. Every single solitary other Jewish ceremony was stripped out and replaced by either Moses or by one of Moses' descendants, one of the next leaders of the Hebrew church, replaced those ceremonies. Passover and Yom Kippur and all these things are after. They are after the Exodus, not before. From 5000 BC, of the time of, give or take the time of Adam, up to 1000 BC, 5000 BC to 1000 BC, that's 4,000 years. Are you trying to tell me and make me believe logically that there's not a single Jewish scholar in that 4,000 year period of time who wasn't interested in writing down anything, who didn't explore written words, who did not break from tradition and demand to write down the oral stuff? Are you telling me there's not one of them that did that? That goes beyond credibility to the point of roll on the floor laughing. There is no possibility of that being true. 4,000 years, and there wasn't a single Jewish scholar that wrote anything down, that wrote their information down, that at least wrote their own ideas about what the oral traditions were. None of that exists. So if none of that exists, or very excessively little, only in the several centuries before the Exodus, which occurred around 1330 BC, if none of that existed, then it was either destroyed or it's someplace that we don't know how to read. Now, part of the tabernacle system of Adam, part of the reason why Zerubbabel built the building different than King Solomon is because he wanted to build a building that was human-like, to give the idea that the building could sit up, could stand up, and look at the thing it's connected to, which was the Bent Pyramid. To get the Jews looking at the pyramids, because if they're looking at the pyramids, they can remember where Israel is. And if they remember where Israel is, this is a great thing. Because if they can remember where Israel is, they can go home. Ignore the Hebrew garbage. Go home. Remember your base language. Remember your base knowledge. The pyramids, I theorize, are the first still in existence that have not been destroyed yet printing of the book of Genesis. And it was Jacob and his son Judah who were put in charge of by the Old Kingdom, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom from 26 to 21, which is the exact time the pyramids were built. All the pyramids have a symbol on them, a symbol of construction on them, being a royal symbol. The symbol, in effect, breaks down to north, vertical, because it was compass bearing. There was no magnetic north. It was Polaris. Well, at that point, it was the constellation Draco, or translates into Latin as dragon. The constellation Dragon, which is vertical. North, vertical. Umber, sacred, divine. Land, defined area. Northumberland, which translates from English into Gaelic, which is the language of the British, as Wyr Hen Ogle DD. Ogle, the Ogle family, Ogle Castle, which is where Emperor Constantinus was forced to get down on his knees and beg for forgiveness and surrender to his future father-in-law, the father of Aunt Helen, who built the temple over the Cave of the Nativity. Her actions were from, she had a full and complete education in the ancient Jewish mysticism. Since she had a full and complete education in ancient Jewish mysticism, she also had a full and complete education in, she knew what the cave was. She also knew where the nativity took place. She also knew where the crucifixion took place. The problem is that there was a major issue with Rome at the time, and the descendants of Paul, she wanted to take power away from the descendants of Paul and have everyone have a nice, good, hard think for a while. And when everyone knew the Dark Ages was coming, everyone knew the medieval times was coming, because the church, Paul's church, hates education. They loathe it. They're disgusted by education. They don't want their citizens to be educated, because if their citizens are educated, they ask questions. They say, we don't like these actions. You're not leaders. You're not allowed to do these things because those things are going to hurt us. Don't do this. And leaders do not like having their authority questioned. If they want to hurt their populations, they want to do so and have their populations just suffer and die and shut up. This is not good and completely unacceptable. So Paul's line, which is directly from ECU, which is directly from the Hyksos, and led directly to St. Augustine, Florida, because that's the namesake of St. Augustine, is St. Augustine of Agrippa, which is a city which used to be a suburb of Carthage, until the city of Carthage was dismantled shipped to Rome and reassembled as the primary buildings of the Senate, because the buildings had fallen into disrepair. So the Julia and Lucia families and other families and other senators decided to rebuild the buildings using Carthage, which is the same thing they did. They decided to rebuild part of other buildings using Memphis, Egypt, and Caligula had Heliopolis moved from Egypt to the Julii estate, just outside of the gates of Rome, on the other side of the river, to a swamp, marshy area that he had dug out and made into a dry dock. He then sailed the ship directly into the dry dock and then had this dry dock filled in. That dry dock became the location of the Vatican, although next door. Whole situation regarding that, the tabernacle system of Adam built into the pyramids, two of the pyramids, and the Nativity, King Solomon's temple. That configuration goes along with the pyramids, which are the first still in existence printing of the book of Genesis, because the Exodus would not have happened for 1,500 years. Now, the events at the end of Genesis ends with the construction of the pyramids. Exodus 1 takes place 1,500 years later with Moses. Now, the next 4 books are all about Moses. Now, he does go a little bit into history in some of his other books, but it's all about, let's relate all these ancient events to me. Despite the fact that he was a Hyksos. He was not a Jew. He was a Hyksos. He's from Esiu's line in both biology and philosophy. And what he did in his life, he was able to lie all from the beginning of from his first breath to his last breath. He lied the whole time, and he was punished for it mercilessly. He wasn't even allowed to enter his brand new kingdom of Levant lands, which he had renamed to Israel. Lie. He wasn't allowed to do that because he lied so much. All those lies, all those deceptions, all that hiding of the truth is, for all intents and purposes, the definition of evil. All that intents and purposes, the definition of evil, means that what the tabernacle system is and how it functions needs to be completely re-examined from square one.